if you were trying to hide the ball and hide the contradiction, would you actually highlight the fact that there's other manuscripts that say something different? Or are you being credible because you're saying, look, this is what we think the actual original said? All rise and welcome to All Rise. This is a podcast hosted by me, Abdu. All Rise is a podcast where we take a look at the claims for and objections against the Christian faith from a legal perspective. In other words, we take a look at the objections and the evidences in favor of the Christian faith and say, would they hold up to the kind of scrutiny you'd have for the kind of evidence and the kind of arguments you'd actually have admissible in a court of law? We look at rules of evidence, rules of civil procedure, even criminal procedure at times, the way that juries think, the way that juries are instructed to make their decisions, and how judges make their rulings. And we're trying to put things to that kind of level of scrutiny. Once in a while, we'll have just a legal hook that will show just how a convincing argument can be made and ways to actually respond to convincing arguments as well. So today's objection that we're going to be covering is, it's a common one, usually about the reliability of the Bible, particularly when it comes to whether the Bible has contradictions or mistakes in it. And what I'm going to do is play a clip from a Muslim, from a TikToker actually, who goes by the handle is One True Message, and the title of the video is The Bible Exposed. And we're going to play the whole thing. It's about a minute and a half, but we're going to hear the objection, or actually hear the challenge to the Christian faith, specifically the reliability of the Bible and whether it comes from God, right from the lips of a Muslim encountering a man who I believe is a Christian and seeing the response. So here's the video. Let's take a listen or a watch.
I believe God can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, for sure, yeah.
So the Bible should have no mistakes in it.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree, yeah.
And if there were mistakes in the Bible, would you have a problem with that?
I would definitely question myself.
Let me show you one, okay? Just so you can see. And this is clear cut, okay? So this is 2 Kings, okay? He's talking about Ahaziah, okay? The 2 Kings 8:26. He was 22 years old when Ahaziah began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. How old was he?
22.
22, yeah?
20 years old, yeah.
And who are we talking about?
Isaiah.
Okay. Now, if the same Ahaziah in Second Chronicles was 42 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned a year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, daughter of Omri. If you can address this one point for me.
Quick, please.
So, why is God making a mistake here?
What mistake?
How old is Isaiah when he began to reign? Was he 22 or 42?
22 years old, right?
He's 22 or 42. Which one is it?
But how is that a mistake though? I don't get it. Like, how is that
How old are you?
21.
Okay. Are you 21 or 41?
21.
21. You can't be both.
Yeah.
So why has Isaiah got two ages here?
I have no idea.
That sounds like a pretty impressive objection. So today's objection, like I said, comes from a common sort of objection, and not just this particular set of passages from 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 26, comparing it to 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 22. But there's alleged contradictions like that in the Bible in various places. And you can see the force of the argument. It's got rhetorical force. I mean, it's clean. The Muslim who has basically challenged a Christian on the street, because if you're watching this, you've seen the video and you've seen the transcript, or the captions. But if you're listening to this only on the podcast, on the audio podcast, what the scene here actually is there's a Muslim guy, actually two Muslim guys, who have approached a Christian guy and opened up a Bible and said, look, basically this is their argument. Do you believe God can make mistakes? And the answer, of course, from the Christian is no. And so if the Bible came from God, then it should contain no mistakes. And he says, okay, I buy that. He says, well, what if I showed you that there's a mistake in the Bible? Would you then question whether the Bible actually came from God? So that's actually a pretty straightforward, clean way to set up the objection. Now, it's very clean. He goes through, he's got his exhibits sort of marked. He's got 2 Kings and he's got 2 Chronicles, as a good lawyer would have, and he has it so he can flip right to them really quickly and efficiently without wasting a lot of time fumbling through pages and that kind of thing. It makes for a really good TikTok video. And he sets it up really, really well. So what he's done, this particular Muslim guy, is actually done a wonderful job at cross-examination. It's a well-executed cross-examination. And that's the legal hook I actually want to focus on for at least part of the time we have together in this particular episode, is what is cross-examination versus direct examination? It's important we understand that there's a difference between these two things, because oftentimes when you see the courtrooms in television or whatever it might be, is the best parts, the gotcha moments in these movies or in these TV episodes is when the lawyer is doing cross-examination and he's leading the witness down a path, and that witness suddenly either contradicts himself or herself or makes an admission that they otherwise wouldn't do, or the jury is stunned and there's a sort of a Perry Mason moment, as it were. I got to tell you, those are relatively rare. Those happen very infrequently in actual trials, but they do happen if you are good at the art of cross-examination. So now, just give me a moment here to give you a primer on the difference between cross-exam and direct exam. So here's the difference. A direct exam is usually when a lawyer is presenting what's called his or her case in chief. They're trying to prove their case. So if you're the plaintiff in a civil suit, you put on your case in chief. You bring your witnesses, you bring your documentary evidence, and you present your case. So if I bring a witness on who is in my favor, who's establishing a certain fact, I bring that witness on, and then I give direct examination. Now, in direct examination, you don't have what's called leading questions. In fact, it's objectionable to actually have leading questions. What's the difference between a leading question and a more open-ended or direct question? So on direct examination, what you'd have is you'd have a witness up there and you'd say, please state your name for the record. And they state their name for the record. And then you say, well, what's your occupation? What do you do? How long have you been at the company? Or how long have you been a police officer? Or whatever it might be. And during the course of the exam, you'd say, okay, did you have occasion to be at the meeting on October 11th at 9 a.m. 2021? And they might say, yeah, I was there. Okay, what were you doing there? And they say what they were doing there. Who else was there? And they establish who else was in the room. What happened next? And then, so these kind of questions. You notice something about the question. You're not suggesting the answer. You're actually trying to elicit a response that gives the jury the gist of what happened. So you're not trying to get someone to say yes or no to a question. You're trying to get them to say, what actually happened? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you yourself actually do? So questions like, what happened? What did you do? What did that person do? How did you feel when this happened? What was your next reaction? Did you look in the book to find out if the documents were actually, these kind of questions. They're open-ended questions. They don't suggest the answer. They're eliciting a response. And so what's interesting is, in a direct examination, the lawyer is not the focus at that point of the trial. In fact, the lawyer is not supposed to be the focus. What he or she wants is for the witness to be the focus. So the jury is focused on the witness, not on what the lawyer's asking, but on what the witness is actually answering. Because, as I've said in previous episodes before, is that in trials, what the lawyer says is not evidence. What the witnesses say, and what the documents say, and what the exhibits provide, that's evidence. What the lawyers say, that's not evidence, that's argument. So you want, on direct examination, if you're presenting your case in chief, you want your witness to be the one who is the star of the show. Cross-examination is different. Now, you don't typically cross-examine your own witness unless somehow that witness turns hostile, and there are limited exceptions to that. But typically, you don't cross-examine your own witness. What happens is you get done examining your witness with a direct examination. What happened next? Where were you, sir? What did she say in response to that? This kind of thing. Now, the other lawyer, the lawyer for the defendant, for example, or what have you, a cross-defendant, whatever it might be in a trial, stands up and has some things and says, okay, I want to challenge what you just said on direct examination. I want to cross-examine you and find out what it was, whether or not we can actually test the reliability of or the factual accuracy of what you just said. And so typically what happens in cross-exam is what's called a leading question. So a leading question is something that suggests the answer. Is either usually yes or no. It doesn't always have to be that way, but you'll have an answer where it'll be something along the lines of, and so the color of the light was red, wasn't it? And sir, you were standing directly on the street corner, weren't you? or you were to the right of the defendant when this happened. Isn't that true? Notice what's happening here. You're not asking for where you were in relation to the defendant. You're actually suggesting the answer. The answer is either yes or no. And this happened, by the way, in the video we just saw. That actually specifically happened, where he was saying things like, God can't make mistakes, right? Suggesting the answer. And if the Bible contained a mistake, that would cause you to have concern, I'm paraphrasing him, of course, about whether or not the Bible came from God. Isn't that true? Yes. And then he starts to say, okay, well, let's read. And, he goes through, he reads what the Bible says in 2 Kings about the rule of a man named Ahaziah. Now, it sounds like he's saying Isaiah in the video. So if you're watching this or you're listening to this on the podcast, the audio version, he's talking about Ahaziah, Ahaziah, not Isaiah. And in 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 26, Isaiah takes his rule at age 22. In 2 Chronicles, which is a parallel account of the kings of Israel, in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, he points out that the Bible says that the same guy, Ahaziah, doesn't take his reign at age 22, but rather age 42. So he's saying this. He's saying, so, basically, how old are you, sir? Because the guy didn't understand exactly what the objection was. And he said, look, the Bible is saying that Ahaziah's age is either 22 or 42, but you can't be both. And he does a wonderful job of leading the witness. Now, that's not improper in and of itself when you're doing cross-exam. If you're doing a direct examination, that is improper. In fact, that's the objection. Objection, Your Honor, he's leading the witness. You can lead a witness if you're doing cross-exam. In other words, if that witness is hostile to you. And one could say, that's exactly what's happening here, is a Muslim guy is talking to a Christian guy about whether or not the Bible is actually the Word of God and accurate and doesn't contain any mistakes. And so he cross-examines this guy in order to show him or to get him down a path where through leading questions, he's narrowing the field down. A leading question, a good leading question, cuts off the avenues by which a witness can answer. You lock them into yes or you lock them into no, and then they basically cannot go back from that because now they've committed before the jury and before themselves to a certain yes or no answer. And so once that's the case, now they're locked in and you're leading them down to the one question where they have to answer if they're going to be credible one way or the other. And that's how the video ends, where the guy says, 2 Kings says he's 22, 2 Chronicles says he's 42. He can't be both, right? Yeah, what do you make of that? And the guy says, I have no idea. That's an interesting, and of course, that's how the TikTok ends. My guess is that conversation was actually much longer, but that's what a cross-exam does. It locks you in and gets you to a certain point. Again, nothing inherently wrong with it. But notice something. The witness is not the star of the show. If you look at that video or you listen to the audio of it, in a direct examination, the witness is the star. So in this case, you could say either the witness is the Bible or the witness is the Christian guy who says, I don't really see a mistake at first. Okay, you could see that, but the star of the show on cross-examine, that is the lawyer. Because the lawyer is just trying to lock the witness in, and the rhetorical force, the artistry of the question, the way in which the lawyer actually uses, he's not manipulating in a bad way. He's not manipulating in an untrue way, if they're ethical. He's in control of the conversation because he's using the actual truth to narrow down and not give any wiggle room to a witness who otherwise might try to wiggle out of something. And again, I'm not trying to be unfair to this guy. I think he did a really masterful job of cross-examination, and he didn't do anything nefarious. He didn't do anything underhanded. He just did what a good lawyer would do, which is try to challenge someone. But again, notice this. He, the Muslim guy in that video, is the star of the show. The Bible isn't the star, and the Christian guy isn't the star. Rather, they're the foil for how the Muslim guy does a great job of taking what it seems like a contradiction and getting the Christian to doubt himself, or at least doubt the veracity of the Bible. So that's what's going on here. So when you go back to the clip, what the Muslim guy did was engage in a cross-examination of this witness, of this Christian. So now he's trying to prove his case that the Bible isn't a divinely inspired holy book. So if we hear the clip again, and go back and rewind and go watch it with this in mind, with the understanding of cross-examination in mind, and I think you'll actually see what I'm saying. So go back and watch it or listen to it, and you'll see exactly how cross-examine actually works. In fact, let's do something else. Instead of just you going and rewinding, let's do it right now. We're actually going to play the clip itself. And with this idea of what a cross-examination is in mind, why don't I think you'll see the difference between what a sort of just a conversation where someone says, hey, I found something in the Bible that looks like a contradiction. Can you explain it? Versus someone who's cross-examining you to say, I challenge you to explain it. You can't. I'm going to make the point here for you. So let's take a listen to this once again.
I believe God can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
So the Bible should have no mistakes in it.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree. Yeah.
See how that's leading? Now he says, do you agree with that? But of course the answer is yes. There's no way to say no. No, I don't agree. Now that might have a much larger conversation, but you see what he's doing. He's leading the whole time.
If there were mistakes in the Bible, would you have a problem with that?
I would definitely question myself.
Let me show you one, okay? Just so you can see. And this is clear cut, okay?
Stop there too. He says this is clear cut. Now he's already set it up. Now I would object at that particular moment. If I was a lawyer for the defense, I'd say objection. Just because the lawyer says it's clear cut doesn't mean it's actually clear cut. Maybe there's more to it than that. See what he's done? He's set it up. He's actually testified before the jury, which is the viewers of this video, and said, oh, it's clear cut. And in order to do that, you can't just say it. You actually have to lay what's called the foundation in the law. Now, he does do a good job of pointing out, here's what 2 Kings says, here's what 2 Chronicles says. So I'm not trying to poo-poo that necessarily right here and now, but he's already set it up where it's clear cut. So he's put in the mind of the witness, and he would put in the mind of the jury very cleverly that whatever I say next is going to be obviously a clear-cut contradiction.
So this is 2 Kings, okay? He's talking about Ahaziah, okay? The 2 Kings 8:26. He was 22 years old when Ahaziah began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. How old was he?
22.
22, yeah?
20 years old, yeah.
And who are we talking about?
Isaiah.
Okay.
Now that sounds like an open-ended question because he's saying, how old was he? And who are we talking about? It sounds open-ended because he's not saying, it's Ahaziah, right? And it's he was 22 years old, right? That would be more along the lines of a leading question, those second two. But essentially what he's done is he's asked an open-ended question, but he's set it up so much so that there's no way the guy could answer any way other than that.
Okay. Now, if the same Ahaziah in Second Chronicles was 42 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned a year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, daughter of Omri. If you can address this one point for me.
Quick, please.
So, by the way, it's edited there because he started to set something up and it was edited, and I think because in the original video there was a bit of back and forth that wasn't quite as clean as this video would suggest the conversation actually was. Let's keep listening.
Is God making a mistake here?
What mistake?
See what happens? He says, why is God making a mistake here? So he's already assumed something, and we'll get to this in a minute. He says, why is God making a mistake? I would object at that particular moment too to objection assumes a fact, not an evidence, or he lacks foundation. Why is that? Because he's pointed out that 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings don't match up in terms of the age, and we'll get to how that can be explained in a minute. But he gets to that and he says, why is God making a mistake here? Now, that's an assumption. He's made an assumption that God has made a mistake if the ages are different in the two accounts of Ahaziah's initial rule, or when he begins to reign as king. See what he's done? He actually hasn't. You might be able to say, oh, there is the scribe who inscribed this particular family of manuscripts in 2 Chronicles. Maybe he made a mistake, but you're making a leap here to say God made a mistake. And what he's done essentially is infuse sort of the Muslim mindset about how the Quran actually was transmitted, and the claim, and it's just a claim, by the way, that the Quran was perfectly preserved and there were never any mistakes in the transmission of the Quran or any variants within the manuscript families of the Quran, as opposed to the Bible and that kind of thing. So he's already inserted something, and I would object. The question is improper. However, let's go on for the rest of the show, because the rest of the conversation here, because the point he's trying to make is that there's a discrepancy, and in the particular version of the Bible he's using, there is a discrepancy between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, which we'll answer in a second. But he's doing a wonderful job of leading this guy into a conclusion that's almost inescapable if you grant the questions.
How old is Isaiah when he began to reign? Was he 22 or 42?
22. 22 years old, right?
He's 22 or 42. Which one is it?
But how is that a mistake though? I don't get it. Like, how is that?
How old are you?
21.
Okay. Are you 21 or 41?
21.
21. You can't be both.
Yeah.
So why has Ahaziah got two ages here?
I have no idea.
That was a masterful way to do it. Now he used some open-ended questions, but again, those open-ended questions inevitably lead to the answer. So they're closed-ended, but in an open-ended kind of a crafty sort of way in which you formulate the question. So that's good. It's a good example of how you can, if you allow someone to be in control of a conversation, where you can be led down a certain path and completely honestly answering the questions as they're presented to you, and then be led to a certain area. You're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with this. Like the guy said, I have no idea how in which these two things can be seemingly contradictory. Now, by the way, I don't think the Muslim was being underhanded. I don't think the Christian guy was being underhanded. In fact, he was being quite humble. He says, I have no idea. He was trying to test it out and that kind of thing. So in the court of law, I would object to say it was leading if, in fact, this was just a witness for the other side. But there's no judge to sustain that kind of an objection in these kind of conversations. And plus, it's okay to ask leading questions in conversations. There's no rule of evidence that says that leading questions are inherently wrong, absent certain circumstances. But there's a thing about burden of proof here. And this is where I want to make sure there's an important thing for us to recognize. One, I said in previous episodes, and you always have to remember this, the person making the claim bears the burden of proving that claim. So if you make a claim that the Bible is from God and contains no mistakes, and you make that claim, you have to actually sustain that claim. You actually have to prove that. If I claim the Bible has mistakes, then I have to sustain that as well. And so all I'm saying here is that if I'm making the claim and I bring a witness, and then let's say I say that witness is a hostile witness, like a Christian, and I want to basically show to the jury that even a Christian admits that the Bible has mistakes, then I can possibly do leading questions that get you down a certain path and get you to agree that there is a contradiction between 2 Kings 8:26 and 2 Chronicles 22 verse 2. And so you might say leading. Now, here's my point in this, okay? My point in this is that if you're having a real conversation, and I don't mean this wasn't a real conversation, but if you're having a conversation where you're trying to explore whether there is a contradiction, you're not trying to necessarily prove that there is a contradiction, you can slow the conversation down. And so when you see questions like this, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, by the way, this is for everybody, you're engaging in a conversation where it becomes a leading, where it's essentially you have to say yes or no, or you have to say, what age are you, 21 or 41? And he says 21. You can't be both. Obviously, the answer is right. You can't be both. When you see that, you're being led down a certain path, and that's fine. I've done it before myself. It's not inherently a problem. However, all I'm asking is that you take a look and say, are we having a conversation about the possibility here, or are we looking down to prove something in specific? And either way is fine. Just be aware of the situation you find yourself in. How can you slow down the conversation? Witnesses do this all the time on cross-examination. It's not always proper, but oftentimes it can be proper, is where a lawyer asks a witness a yes or no question. And sometimes the lawyer will say, Your Honor, the witness is being, cagey. You won't use the word cagey, but the witness is not answering, is being non-responsive. Please direct the witness to answer my question, because it's a yes or no question, and the witness wants to go on and say something that's not a yes or no answer. But sometimes there isn't really a good yes or no answer to a yes or no question. You can say, it depends, or I'm not sure I understand your question, sir. Now, sometimes you can look like you're trying to get out of a clear-cut problem, and you have to be careful of that, because sometimes we are. I mean, we're all humans, and we don't like to lose arguments or look like we're foolish or whatever. But oftentimes, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It's like, I will make sure I understand the point of your question. Can you give me a second here? So what would happen in this particular instance with this particular interaction between this Muslim guy and this Christian guy? I think what I would have done essentially is say, hold on a second. When you say God can't make mistakes, and so that there's a mistake in the Bible that would cause you to question, I would go back and look at what do I understand as a Christian to be the divine inspiration of the Bible? Is it dictation? Does it mean that the Bible fell out of the sky in the exact form we have it? Does any book that claims to be a holy book have a history where the people who claim that book is the book of God or gods or whatever it is, did it just fall out of the sky, or do they have a history? And the reality is, holy books do have a history. And I'm quoting directly from the title of a book by a scholar who has since passed away, a wonderful guy who I knew personally while he was here. His name is Keith Small, and he had a book called Holy Books Have a History, where he talks about the fact that all holy books have some level of history of transmission, and there's scribal errors, and there's development of language, and these kind of things. They don't just fall out of the sky in the form that we have them today. And he was comparing the Quran and the Bible, and he is an expert in Quranic manuscripts and orthography, which is basically the way you study the way the actual print evolves over time of various ancient manuscripts. So I would stop and say, well, just because there is a mistake or a seeming contradiction between this account and this account doesn't necessarily mean that God made a mistake. Maybe it does, but doesn't necessarily mean that. And so now we have to have a conversation about what it means to be divinely inspired. And is the original, the actual wording, divinely inspired, or is the transmission down through the centuries sort of divinely, kept in a certain way? And I think that there is some level of that with the Bible as well, but we can slow down the conversation with a little more background. Say, okay, so what do you mean by this, and where are we going with this exactly, and what does it mean for God to have made a mistake? And maybe even asking a question and even asking a question of your interlocutor. The Muslim guy is asking the Christian guy a question. Well, what if the Christian guy said, well, what's your understanding? Hold on a second. What's your understanding of how we got the Bible that we have today? What's your understanding of that? Because that might inform a little bit more about why you think this is an insurmountable problem. And you could say something, even be fairly forthright. Say, I see what you've pointed out here, but can I ask you, have you considered any of the responses to what you're actually saying? So whenever you're confronted with something, say, okay, great, sounds impressive the way you said that. You can't be the first person in 2,000 years to have noticed this. I mean, it just can't be the case. Someone has to have noticed this. And yet 2 billion people claim to be Christians. And so someone has to have responded to this at some point. What are the responses, and what have you found lacking in those responses? That's a fair question. You see what you've done? You've slowed the conversation down in a way that says, let's get to the issue here and see if this is more of I'm just doing this for a TikTok clip, or are we doing this for an actual conversation? And I realize it's not fair necessarily to put this guy to that level of a test, because he is doing it for a TikTok clip. And it's, again, nothing nefarious about what he's done, but you can take the control of the conversation, because if you think about it, the Bible's been around for millennia. Someone has to have noticed that there is a discrepancy here. This guy can't be the first guy. And yet there are still Christians, most likely Christians, who have noticed this, or Jews who have noticed this. What is their answer? What is their response? And why have they come to those conclusions? And what do you find lacking about them? See, what you've done is you turned a cross-examination of you into a direct examination where you're actually looking at the evidence, and you're making the Bible the witness now. I think that's an important way to look through this. So you take away gotcha moments and you turn them into a real conversation. So having said all that, what is the response? What can we look at in terms of an actual response to this seeming contradiction? I think there's a lot of responses that are out there, by the way, about whether or not the 42 is actually a reference to Ahaziah's father, or it's something else referring to a dynastic reign, and so the age isn't really Ahaziah's age, and all that. And those have some merit. I think they have some serious problems with them as well, and you're free to look at those, obviously, as you like. I think, honestly and straightforwardly, the most compelling answer is that it's a copyist error, that the copy in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, that somewhere in the family of manuscripts that made it into this particular version of the Bible, and I said I'd get to that in a minute, that actually is a copy error, that someone wrote 42 when they meant 22, and that copy simply went down through got copied and recopied by copyists after this one, thinking that 42 was the actual number that should have been in the original manuscript, when it all started with the original copy error. Now, does that bother us? Well, it at least causes some level of historical inquiry. So what do I mean by all this? Let me unpack it for you slightly, if you don't mind my doing so in the time we have. The Old Testament, is largely based, the one we have today, the one that we read today, is largely based on what's called the Masoretic text. The Masoretes were a group of Jews who wanted to actually write down the oral tradition that had been sustained for centuries before into a Masoretic text, which was going to be a work that would codify and solidify the Old Testament into a Hebrew language and a sort of an authoritative canon of the Old Testament. And they did their work mostly in this textual tradition beginning in the 2nd century AD or earlier, but their text was really not completed until about the 10th century or about 1000 AD. And they did most of their work between 500 and 1000 AD, with the bulk of it really happening in the 7th century AD. So just for context, that's 700 years after Jesus or so. So that's how late this work was being done. It's very reliable, by the way. The Masoretic text is extremely reliable, and a lot of the manuscript evidence we're seeing of the Old Testament, the more we're uncovering that's even earlier than the Masoretic text, is actually confirming the reliability of the Masoretic texts. Then the major contributions was creating a fixed Hebrew text, turning older consonantal texts. And a consonantal text sounds like a funny or fancy word, but essentially a consonantal text is one in which only the consonants of that language are actually transmitted. So consonants in English are like B, C, D, K, M. The vowels, of course, are A, E, I, O, and U. Now, in ancient Semitic texts like Arabic and Hebrew, the consonants were the main letters and the vowels were either not included at all in the texts, or they were later added for clarity up above and below in certain ways, small little additions that gives you, oh, that's what that sounds like. So you had consonantal texts, and then the Masoretes wanted to take the consonantal text and add some vowelization so you could get a true vocalization of what the text actually said. So that was their main goal. And they added accents and consonantal notations in about the 9th and 10th centuries. Though their desire was to continue the work of previous scribes and transmitters, and they had tried to do this stuff even earlier, like 400 BC to 200 AD, to maintain a thorough oral tradition. The reality is that there are some signs that the Masoretic text had some choices that had a sort of an anti-Christian agenda in them, but that is probably not super relevant at this particular point. The point is that there are actually some competing family of manuscripts in the Masoretic tradition. Now, some texts, some manuscripts of the Old Testament that are as old or even older than the Masoretic text we have today, it forms the largest basis of our Old Testament. Older traditions, as we're discovering more and more older manuscripts, they actually have readings in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, that include 22, or sometimes 20, which is closer, of course, to 20 than 42. And this is partly why the Masoretic text exists. Certain Jewish groups and authorities wanted one textual tradition to sort of be the authoritative one. And there were certain translations of the Old Testament from Greek and Syriac and Arabic, and these texts contained readings that are actually in agreement. In other words, there were a Hebrew text that was translated into Greek or Syriac or Arabic even earlier than the Masoretic text, and those earlier translations, which show us what the original actually said. In other words, if these Arabic, Syriac, and Greek translations are earlier than the Masoretic text, well, they're based on something. They're based on the Hebrew. And those families of texts have 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, not say 42, which would be a contradiction to 2 Kings, but they actually say 22. The oldest translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Syriac is the Peshitta. Scholars believe it was the work of multiple translators over an extended period of time, beginning in the 1st or 2nd century AD, and this version includes 2 Chronicles 22, verse 2, reading of 22 rather than 42. So these translations, which are earlier than the Hebrew Masoretic text, were translated from an even earlier Hebrew text, and shows that the original, as close as we can make it from the evidence adduced that we have so far, is that there is no contradiction between 2 Kings and Second Chronicles, which gives us external evidence outside of the document that 42 was a copyist error, and other manuscript families better attested. Earlier manuscript families actually show that the original said 22, and so the original had no contradictions in them. There's a whole lot more to this, by the way, but this is just sort of a response to this kind of thing, so we can see it. There's actually internal evidence, because one person could say, well, wait a minute. Anytime you see a contradiction, you just say, oh, copyist error, and you get out of the contradiction. Well, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it could be a copyist error. Maybe it's not a copyist error, but in this particular instance, now you have to prove that it's a copyist error. And if you look at the the earlier manuscript traditions, you'd see that there actually is a copyist error in the Masoretic texts, which come to be the basis of the King James Version of the Bible and the New King James Version of the Bible, which is the version, the New King James is likely the version this Muslim guy used in this conversation with this Christian guy, so that he would actually see a contradiction. Now, there are some internal evidences as well. I'm not just crying out, oh, copyist error, and I get out of it. I've proved it's a copyist error through the external evidence, but there's also some internal evidence that shows that 22 is most likely the actual original of 2 Chronicles 22, verse 2. The textual evidence shows merely that there is a discrepancy in the manuscripts, and the internal evidence shows a little bit more. Let me give you some examples. The internal evidence is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 5 and 21, verse 20. These texts point out that Ahaziah's father, Jehoram, was 40 years old when he died. Ahaziah could not have been 42 when he became king of Judah, because that would mean that he was 2 years older than his father. Thus, what we likely have in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, is a copyist error that made its way into the family of manuscripts. And that's important. So now we go to sort of like a selective use of biblical translations. Now, one could actually talk about, is the Bible got versions? And this word is sometimes problematic for me, because people say, oh, it's the King James Version of the Bible, or it's the New International Version, or it's the English Standard Version. And the reason why that's a troubling word or a problematic word is not because it shows the Bible has these various versions, like the ESV is, Bible, 16.1. And the New King James Version was Bible 12.1. Like our OS has different versions of it, or updated versions. It's not an updated version. It's actually a more scholarly rendition, or it's a different scholarly translational philosophy that's being used on that particular translation of the Bible. So a better way to think of it is not that the ESV is the English Standard Version, rather it's the English Standard Translation of the Bible. And so the way they look at certain words in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek and say, okay, the receptor language is going to be English, we look at things and say, but that word doesn't exactly pair with this English word, so how are we going to make sure that the English actually properly conveys what the original Hebrew actually said? So there's different theories on how to translate. That's true of the Quran as well. That's true of the Upanishads or the Vedas or any holy book or any ancient text in a different language other than English. You have to make choices when you make translational choices in how to actually say, this is what this actually means in the original language. And there's not always a perfect fit, because languages are like that. Second, however, is that once those translations, that the philosophy is established, you also take, well, what am I going to use as the best evidence for what the original actually said? So the original the older the manuscripts, the better attested, the more numerous they are, or the closer, and there's various ways you do this, find out that maybe these are better attested manuscripts, there are more numerous ones, they enjoyed certain level of authority within certain communities, or whatnot. You find out that the earliest and better attested manuscripts are actually closer to the original than the later ones. So that's what you have with various books of the Bible. And so what you have is, the more we look into manuscripts, the better off we are, the more information there is that looks to the original text of the Bible, because we're looking at better manuscripts and we're discovering them all the time. Now, so we have a really, really, really good idea of what the original actually said, because we don't have the actual 2 Kings or the actual 2 Chronicles. We have copies of them. in manuscript evidences that go back to the original. So that's why in later translational efforts, like the ESV or the NIV or the NASB or the NET, the New English Translation, they actually will not have a contradiction. If you read 2 Kings and you read 2 Chronicles, and that guy tried to pull it off with a different version of the Bible, not the New King James Version, he wouldn't be able to do it because that's not there. And someone could say, well, wait a minute. You just erased the contradiction by having a selective version. Those versions were there to get rid of the contradictions. That's why they did it. It's all nefarious. It's all underhanded. It's all a way to whitewash the inherent contradictions of the Bible. No, it's not. Here's why I know that. There's two reasons. One is that they're basing it on an eclectic look at the actual manuscripts. The New King James Version used the exact same manuscripts that formed the basis of the King James Version. The New King James Version kept the poetry of the King James, but updated the language so that it was more in plain English that we have today. But the manuscript evidence was essentially the same as the King James, and that was from centuries and centuries ago. We've advanced quite a bit in our understanding of the ancient manuscripts. And so with that level of progress, you get better attested manuscripts, which is why the ESV, NIV, NASB, and others don't have a contradiction because they say that the earliest manuscripts don't contradict each other. So you're not hiding the ball in the new translations. What you're doing is you're actually getting to the actual truth through the new translations. And that truth happens to be that there is no contradiction here. Second is that when you look at those new translations, they're not hiding the ball at all. Look at Second Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, about Ahaziah's age. And you'll see it says 22, but there's a footnote in all of them that say, some manuscripts say 42. If you were trying to hide the ball and hide the contradiction, would you actually highlight the fact that there's other manuscripts that say something different? Or are you being credible because you're saying, look, this is what we think the actual original said based on the evidence. But there is a family of manuscripts out there that has a bit of a contradiction. That's not being underhanded. That's actually being honest. And so when you look at the ESV, NASB, NIV, you can say in this particular instance, honesty is prevailing, and the honesty of the evidence is there is no contradiction whatsoever. So be careful of sometimes of selective version picking. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, but the reality is that one could argue, and I'm going to touch on this extremely briefly because time runs short. One could say, a Muslim could say, well, if God preserved the original, why didn't God actually preserve the transmission so there would be no mistakes like this where we'd have these debates? And, here's the initial answer. I don't know. I don't know why that's the case. Why didn't God make sure that every person who ever copied the Bible down never made a mistake when they did so? I don't know the answer to that. But here's what I do know, is that every holy book has the same kind of history. Yes, even the Quran and other books as well. In fact, when you look at the Sana manuscripts, some of the oldest we've ever found of the Quran, and then people stopped being able to examine them because it was taken away from them to examine, you find that there are actually variant readings of the text. In fact, when you look at the history of Islam, this is not Orientalists saying this. This is not sort of Western polemicists saying this about Islam. This is actually in the Islamic documents where it actually says that Uthman, one of the Khalifas, or one of the leaders of the Muslims, wanted to conform all Quranic manuscripts that were out there to a standardized version that he found favorable. And so he had Zayd ibn Thabit go out and find all of the distinct manuscripts that differed with each other, bring them together, compare them to Uthman's collective understanding of what the Quran actually was, and then burn all the ones that didn't conform to his understanding of what the original Quran was. Here's the point, is that history of variance has been destroyed. And how do we now have any confidence that what we have now is what Muhammad actually said in the beginning? And the reason why we have less confidence is because we can't compare it to the variants that are out there and say, here's the actual history. We can narrow it down now to the real. What was the original actually there? What did it actually say? With the Bible, we have no such purging. What we have is the evidence is abundant that when you take all the different variants, and none of them have theological significance or even historical significance necessarily, you take them and you see, actually, we can derive what the original actually said because the variants actually help us. And that's another episode possibly. My point is this. I don't know why God chose not to perfectly preserve not perfectly preserve, but guarantee no copyist mistakes. But we can use those copy mistakes to actually get at the original without any hint of obfuscation or a conspiracy to conform everything to a certain standard so we cover up the contradictions. No, they're all out there to be seen. And when compared to each other, we can see actually the original really doesn't have the difficulties that so many people have said they actually have. So the point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that you might be led down a certain path when you're having a conversation. Maybe you'll be maybe you're the one who's doing the leading down the certain path. None of it's nefarious. None of it's wrong. Just recognize when it's happening. Sometimes it's perfectly appropriate, and sometimes you can slow it down to have a more meaningful conversation. Here's the thing. In the end, a lot of these difficulties have been addressed over the course of many centuries. And the more evidence we have, the better off we are in seeing what the original said. And we have a high degree of reason to believe in the reliability of the Christian scriptures. Again, much more could be said. I would actually recommend, once again, Keith Small's book, Holy Books Have a History. He has another book. It's basically an expanded version of Holy Books Have a History, where it's far more academic. And if you're interested in that kind of a thing, and you should be, by the way, it's called Textual Criticism and Quran Manuscripts, where he talks about the fact that the Quran might have some issues along the same lines, the same kind of history the Bible does. It's not casting aspersions at the Quran. It's just saying, look, all holy books have a history. And then if you're interested in the debate on this, I would recommend a debate between Dr. Jay Smith and Dr. Shabir Ali on YouTube about the manuscript issues as well. They did it at the University of Toronto some years ago, and they talk about the manuscript issues, and I think you'll find it quite fascinating if you're looking for more information on this. So ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've seen the objection, you've seen the response to it, and so we ask you to render your verdict. Is there a contradiction that's unresolvable between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles? I think, ladies and gentlemen, your verdict should be no. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Abdu Murray, and the defense rests.